Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what will likely be the first of several virtual programs. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League. The foundation inspires and educates League members, students, and the greater community to be engaged and responsible citizens, guided by the United States Constitution and the history and values of the Union League. We accomplish this through exhibits, publications, civics education, and constitutional programs, scholarships for the citizen leaders of tomorrow, and through lecture programs like the Liberty Series and tonight's Civil War Roundtable. During this current crisis, the Legacy Foundation has expanded its work to include the establishment of the Union League Employees Emergency Fund. I'm pleased to report that to date, over $500,000 has been donated by our generous League members to this cause, and that we've already sent dozens of grants to Union League employees in need. My thanks to everyone who has supported this effort. If you would like to make a contribution, simply visit the League's website or email Kira Foley-Tusman at kira@unionleague.org. That's K-I-R-A @unionleague.org. Prior to each program of the Civil War Roundtable, we have a tradition of honoring a member or a relative of a member who served honorably in our armed services. I thought that tonight it would be most appropriate to remember and honor the namesake of the Union League Civil War Roundtable, Major Charles Izard McEwen. McEwen joined the Union League on January 22nd, 1863, less than a month after the League was founded. He joined the Board of Publications and became its assistant secretary. In 1864, he joined the 198th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, also known as the 6th Union League. On March 29, 1865, at the Battle of Lewis Farm, just 10 days before Lee's surrender, McEwen was shot through the heart and died instantly. McEwen was the first Union League member who died in service of his country to preserve the last best hope on earth. So tonight, we remember McEwen and all League members who served, especially those who gave their lives for our liberty and for our Constitution. Thank you. A few housekeeping items for tonight's program. First of all, for us learning Zoom, like myself, please note our speakers tonight cannot hear or see you. Your mic and camera are off. We do have questions and answers at the end, and for those on Zoom, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're viewing on Facebook or YouTube, you can post your question in comments. We will get to as many as possible. And now, to introduce our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the chair of our program committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Mr. Steve Target.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually here this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, though, I just want to take a moment and from the bottom of all of our hearts, really thank everybody in the Legacy Foundation, John, Kira Foley-Tusman, Joe Ianni, and of course our historian, Jim Mundy. You know, our worlds were turned upside down when we couldn't get face-to-face and run these meetings. So in a very short period of time, through a lot of phone calls and Zoom meetings like this, we strategized and put together, but it wasn't without a great deal of hard work behind the scenes. So as John mentioned, this is the first of many virtual programs that we're going to be presenting, hopefully over a short period of time here before we can get back to face-to-face. And our goal naturally is to stay as connected as members as we can. So looking forward, we have some future public affairs events. We have some Civil War Roundtable events and other May programming. All of those, if we can, are going to be distributed through some sort of virtual program like this. I'd also like to note that there's another program that's being worked on right now. Hopefully, that'll be a weekly discussion about our insight and the insight that we're gathering both from members and from our local community and maybe national community about the COVID-19 crisis, and we'll make sure to distribute that to our membership. That hopefully will be distributed next week for the first time. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Paul Kahan. Paul earned a PhD in US history from Temple, Prior to that, he earned an MA in Modern American History and Literature from Drew University and a BA in History and English with minors in Medieval Renaissance Studies and Music from Alfred University. Dr. Kahan has published several books, including Eastern State Penitentiary History, which was published in 2008. In 2012, he published A Seminary of Virtue, The Ideology and Practice of Inmate Reform at Eastern State Penitentiary, 1829 to 1971. His third book, The Homestead Strike, Labor, Violence, and the American Industry, was published in 2013. And his fourth book, and the subject of tonight's lecture, is titled Amiable, Scoundrel, Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War. And it's a biography of Lincoln's first Secretary of War and a Union League member, Simon Cameron. So ladies and gentlemen, please virtually welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Paul Kahan. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate that very warm introduction, and it is a pleasure to be back at the Union, at least virtually, to talk about my work. I'm coming to you from an undisclosed location in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. And I am delighted to talk about Simon Cameron. As Steve noted, Amiable Scoundrel is actually my fourth book. And if you look at my work, what you see, one of the threads running through it is the history of Pennsylvania or the history of the Philadelphia region. I mean, these are things that I've looked at in a variety of different contexts. And so when I was planning on writing my fourth book, I knew I wanted to do something about the Civil War and its impact on Pennsylvania. And so I went looking for people, prominent Pennsylvanians who were involved in the war effort. And of course, there's no shortage of them. Thaddeus Stevens, James Buchanan, Governor Curtin, and of course, Simon Cameron. And so I remember I was exploring Cameron's life, and up to the publication of Amiable Scoundrel, there were exactly 1 1/2 biographies of Cameron available. The first was published in 1942 and only took Cameron's life up until the 1860 presidential election. And then, I don't know, the author got bored or died of embarrassment, but he didn't write the second volume. And then, of course, there was a Cradle to Grave biography that was published in the mid-1960s, around the time of the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. And I remember sitting at my dinner table complaining to my wife about how really weak these biographies were and how, you know, I could have done so much better. And I think, much to her chagrin, she said, well, then you should write the biography. And I went out to my office, and 14 months later emerged Howard Hughes-like with the manuscript that became Amiable Scoundrel. And I think it's important to recognize that the purpose of the book is not to rehabilitate Simon Cameron. It's not to make you think that he was an angel among men, but rather what I want to do is I want to contextualize Civil War politics. And I think Cameron's career has a lot to teach us about the ways in which political leaders accrued and used political power in the middle decades of the 19th century. So who was Simon Cameron? Well, he was born into relative poverty in 1799, during the last year of George Washington's life. And he died in 1889, during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison, or our 23rd president. So right there, it gives you a sense of the scope of political experience covered in Cameron's life. And he's a national political figure really from about the mid-1830s until his death in 1889. So he's on the scene for a solid 50-year period where he's a behind-the-scenes political operative, a senator, secretary of war, minister to Russia, and then leader of the longest-lived political machine of the 19th century. The political machine that Simon Cameron establishes in Pennsylvania runs the Commonwealth until the New Deal in the 1930s. And that is something that none of his cabinet colleagues could boast of. You know, we talk about the era of Andrew Jackson, but in a lot of ways, we should talk about the era of Simon Cameron, because this is a man who, more than any of his cabinet colleagues and more than many of the political figures that we think of in the mid-19th century, learned how to accrue and use political power to achieve his goals. Now, there are 4 key factors about 19th century politics that I think Cameron's life illuminates. The first is the relationship between state power and national prestige. And if you read political histories of the 19th century, they tend to talk about what's going on in Washington. They tend to be focused on the president and the Congress, and to a lesser extent, the Supreme Court. As well, they should be. But one of the key details that those books often leave out is that the people who got sent to Congress, particularly the Senate, and the people that made it to the White House, almost to a man, built solid state-level political machines. It was their ability to deliver votes on the state level that catapulted them to national fame. And in fact, the great exception to that during Cameron's era is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. And it's really only the very unsettled political environment of 1860 that makes it possible for someone like Lincoln to rise to the presidency. In the careers of people like James K. Polk, James Buchanan, Franklin Pierce to a certain extent, you see years, if not decades, building a state-level reputation that is then leveraged to receive national prestige. And Pennsylvania is a really crucial state. Throughout the 19th century, it has the second highest number of electoral votes. You could not win the White House without winning Pennsylvania. And in fact, throughout the 19th century, the person who receives Pennsylvania's electoral votes is the man who becomes president of the United States. So controlling Pennsylvania, building a state-level machine in Pennsylvania, made the people that did it, James Buchanan and later Simon Cameron, incredibly important figures nationally. It's also crucial to remember that election of the Senate meant getting the state legislature to vote for you. You didn't go before the voters to become a senator. You went to the state legislature and they selected you. So again, they selected people who had the political machines that could guarantee them votes when it came time for their re-elections. So state power to national prestige is one of the key factors that Cameron's life illustrates. The second is the media and the importance of the media. I don't think it'll come as any great surprise that we are living through a period of profound change in the media. I was born on February 6, 1980. Imagine you're my parents sitting at Doylestown Hospital waiting for what can only be described as the greatest event in human history to happen. And let's say you flip on the news. What are your choices? ABC, NBC, CBS? Maybe if the hospital has cable, you could try this newfangled thing called CNN. And then, of course, there are the newspapers, Philadelphia Inquirer, maybe the USA Today, and of course, the local paper. And all of those outlets are struggling to reach the widest possible audience. And they're doing that by pitching relatively the same narrative. The news reporting that you're going to get on ABC is very similar to what you're going to get on NBC, is very similar to what you get on CBS. Now flash forward 40 years. We have an incredibly diverse array, an incredibly diverse media landscape. We have niche websites and Twitter feeds and Facebook posts and podcasts. The barriers to entry have dropped amazingly. I mean, consider the fact that we are all sitting in different places on Earth and meeting as a group. I mean, this is something that couldn't have happened even 10 years ago. And we're doing it relatively inexpensively. Those declining barriers to entry, though, have changed the political calculus. Now, you aren't pitching to the widest possible audience. You are pitching to ever smaller segments of that audience. You're trying to build a niche market. And as a result, our political culture has become much more fragmented, much more aggressive, much more factionalized. Well, you see something similar happening in the 19th century. You see a variety of different technologies, the railroads, the telegraphs, the introduction of steam-powered printing presses, the introduction of cheap wood pulp paper, that radically lowers the cost of creating and transmitting the news, but lowering the barriers to entry, but at the same time creating a massive number of media outlets that need to distinguish themselves and secure patronage. And they do that by aligning themselves with political figures. So if you look around today, you can still see local newspapers that are the Clearfield Republican or the Doylestown Democrat. Because in the 19th century, when those papers emerged, they were the party paper for for that political party. And in some cases, towns had a variety of different papers pitching to various factions of the party. And so Cameron, who is apprenticed to a newspaper office in Harrisburg and is reporting on the doings of the Commonwealth legislature, is ideally suited for this really important technological shift. By the time he reaches young adulthood in the mid-1820s, this technological revolution is underway, and he's sort of in at the ground floor, because not only does he have the understanding of how printing works, but he spent the last few years as an apprentice, if you will, doing political reporting. And it's really as a newspaper man that Cameron first creates his wealth. He spends a year in Doylestown working on Samuel D. Ingham's newspaper, which had a rival Democratic newspaper in Doylestown. Cameron ultimately merges with that newspaper, solidifying Ingham's faction. And then Cameron himself moves back to Harrisburg and starts his own newspaper. So that the changing media landscape is really important. And it's another aspect where Cameron masters his moment. Third aspect, and one that I've already touched on, is the endemic factionalism of American politics in this period. Because political parties are relatively new, they're really unstable coalitions of people that are held together not so much by their shared interests, but by their shared antagonisms, the people that they hate. Cameron is born just as the beginning of that first party system, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, is coming to an end. With the election of 1800, the Federalists go into decline. And by the beginning of the 1820s, we're seeing the emergence of the second party system, where the Democratic Republican Party is splitting into the National Republicans and what becomes known as the Democrats, allied around Andrew Jackson. And when Andrew Jackson's elected in 1828, it's not because of some well thought out platform that the Democratic Party is presenting to voters. It's because of the fact that they can say, we hate all of these different groups of people. We hate the wealthy, and we hate the entitled, and we hate the elites. And so as a result, they build a coalition of people who might not otherwise get along, but share a group of people that they are antagonistic toward. And so finally, how do you keep that very fractious coalition together? With the fourth aspect, which is the spoils system. By the time that we get to the 19th century, the federal government in particular's role in society is beginning to grow. It's printing laws that get passed. It's establishing lighthouse bureaus. It's running customs houses. I mean, there's a lot of federal money and federal jobs that are being created. And so what you do is you dole those out to your supporters in a system that has come to be known as the spoils system. From the point to the victor go the spoils. The idea that you win elections in order to distribute these jobs and these patronage positions to your followers, who in turn show up on election day and vote for you ever higher into office, so that you have more spoils at your command. And Cameron becomes exceptionally good at building a big tent Republican Party in Pennsylvania by cornering and then distributing patronage appointments, and by denying patronage appointments to people who run afoul of him. And it's through that mechanism, more than anything else, that Cameron has been able to build a political machine that lasts 50 years after he dies, because he masters his moment. Who is Simon Cameron? Well, if you know nothing about Simon Cameron, you probably know the famous quote from Thaddeus Stevens. Allegedly, Thaddeus Stevens goes to meet with Abraham Lincoln shortly after the inauguration. And Lincoln says to Stevens, hey, what do you think about Simon Cameron as Secretary of War? And Stevens says, well, you know, he's got a reputation for corruption, though I don't think he would steal a red-hot stove. And this, of course, delights Lincoln, who loves a good joke, particularly at Cameron's expense. And at the next cabinet meeting, he repeats this to the entire cabinet, much to their delight. Cameron is understandably unhappy about this, and the next time he sees Thaddeus Stevens, he says, why would you say something like that to the president? I demand a retraction. So Stevens happens to meet with the president a few weeks later, and as he's getting up to leave, he turns to Lincoln and he says, oh, by the way, the last time I was here, I believe I said Cameron would not steal a red-hot stove. I take that back. And that, of course, has become shorthand for Simon Cameron. He's so corrupt, the only thing he wouldn't steal is a red-hot stove. Or maybe he would. And as a result, I think that reputation for corruption, that reputation for graft, has come to, in a lot of ways, overshadow Cameron's achievements. When the Civil War breaks out, the U.S. Army is 15,000 men weak. And most of those soldiers are out west picking fights with Native Americans. The infrastructure for recruiting, training, clothing, and feeding all of these new recruits barely exists. And Lincoln in April says, I want a 75,000 man army. What he's saying is he wants a five-fold expansion in the number of soldiers in uniform, and he wants it yesterday. And as we're living through this pandemic, which has strained our infrastructure and has strained our resources and was something we were unprepared for, I think you can really understand the challenges, the unique challenges that posed. And so here's Cameron as Secretary of War thrust into the middle of that. He not only has to recruit 60,000 plus men, he has to equip them, he has to train them, he has to feed them, he has to transport them, all in a federal government that is relatively minuscule and has relatively limited financial resources. Well, how did Cameron get to be Secretary of War, you might ask? Cameron has more military experience than any member of Lincoln's cabinet. He had been Adjutant General of the State Militia of Pennsylvania. It's from that he came to be called General for the rest of his life. He had about a year's experience administering the state militia. And he had been selected by Andrew Jackson to be regent, basically on the board of directors of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And he did that for about a year as well. So relatively small military experience, but more than Seward has, more than Chase has, and more than Lincoln has when it gets right down to it. And so Cameron is faced with this really insurmountable political problem and is left basically to sort it out on his own. And here's where the challenge of Simon Cameron as a person comes up. Cameron is a glad-handing politician. He's a machine builder. He's a baby kisser and backslapper. He's not an administrator. And in fact, about 6 months into his tenure at the War Department, a contractor came to see him about where they stood in their negotiations. And Cameron, is of course frazzled. I mean, he's got people in and out of his office all day. And he says, well, where did this stand when we last met? And the contractor said, well, you borrowed my pencil and my notepad. You took a note, you jammed it in your hat, and then you kept my pencil. I mean, you get a sense that Cameron is ultimately overwhelmed by the scope of his responsibilities. It is not a good marriage of man and office. But is Simon Cameron corrupt? One of the things that I think we need to keep in mind is the political culture of the 19th century is very, very different from the political culture of the United States today. We live in an era of post-civil service reform, by which I mean that we have tried to strip government hiring and procurement of politics as much as possible. You don't get a federal job by calling up your congressman and saying, hey, I gave you $50 last year for your campaign. Can you get me a job at the post office? Or can you get me a job at the National Archives? You have to take a test. You have to demonstrate your proficiency. And the vast majority of federal jobs are covered under civil service reform. In the 19th century, that's not how it was. You got federal jobs by knowing influential people, and you were expected to tithe a portion of your salary to those individuals' political causes. Hideously corrupt, but that's how business was done. And even that paragon of political virtue Abraham Lincoln was not above sending blank commissions to prominent senators that he had already signed so that they could hand them out to their political favorites. Both Seward and Chase used their positions in the cabinet to reward political favorites. And actually, Cameron does far less of this than many of his cabinet colleagues, because he knows he's got this reputation for corruption. He knows that Democrats in Congress and the general public are watching him like a hawk, expecting him to do these things, and that it would jeopardize the war effort if he was seen to be doing those kinds of things. So yes, he's doing things that we probably would judge as corrupt, but for his era was actually substantially less. He wasn't pushing the envelope anywhere near the degree that he probably could have, and that many of his cabinet colleagues were. But nevertheless, Cameron has this reputation for corruption that goes back to a minor federal job that he had in the 1830s and dogs him throughout his life. In fact, people are talking about this in the 1870s and even the 1880s. But a lot of it is smoke with no fire. In fact, Lincoln was famous for telling this story about a group of New York bankers who come to see him in the fall of 1861, and they say, look, Cameron is hideously corrupt. You have to fire him. And Lincoln says, bring me a single instance of corruption, and I will have him out on his ear. And this story, of course, gets told in a lot of biographies of Lincoln as, oh, look how magnanimous Abraham Lincoln was. He stood by Cameron. He was so loyal to Cameron. But the reality of the situation was, it was actually the opposite. What he was saying was, if you can prove Cameron is corrupt, bring me proof of it, and I will throw him out. He wasn't defending Cameron. He was saying, I need proof. And the fact that the bankers from New York couldn't bring that proof, I think, should give us some evidence of the degree to which Cameron's reputation for corruption was wildly overblown. I mean, look, Cameron was doing what a lot of people in emergency situations do. They throw money at problems. And again, take a look at this pandemic. We need ventilators, we need PPEs, we need masks, we need all of this equipment. And what are state governments doing? What is the federal government doing? They're throwing money at the problem, often in competition with one another, and as a result, causing the cost of these things to rise. And you see something very similar during the first year of the war. There's no template for buying weapons, buying uniforms, buying wagons, buying horses, buying food. And so as a result, unscrupulous contractors are basically war profiteering. From the competition between the state governments, from private individuals raising regiments, and from the Secretary of War. And it's really only in 1862 that the federal government is able to build an infrastructure that makes it possible for it to arm, recruit, and train the troops that are needed to fight. Cameron is not the world's greatest administrator, but a lot of Edwin Stanton's successes in 1862 owe credit to steps that Cameron was taking in 1861 in order to firm up procurement and ensure that governors were not competing with the War Department. Well, if Cameron wasn't corrupt, then why did Abraham Lincoln accept a letter of resignation that Cameron never wrote? And the answer is very simple, if it's a little surprising. Cameron was pushing the Lincoln administration to arm and equip African American soldiers. From the very first moments of the war, the Lincoln administration was faced with a quandary. What should we do with escaped slaves who make it to Union lines? And this becomes a problem almost from the moment that the shooting begins. By the summer of 1861, it's become a real problem. And the Lincoln administration is faced with a quandary. On the one hand, Lincoln is saying, this is not a war against slavery. This is not a war against slavery. This is a war to ensure compliance with federal law. Because, of course, there are 4 border states that are slave states. And any war that is a war against slavery threatens to alienate those border states. At the same time, slaves are incredibly valuable. They support the backbone of the Southern economy. They can be used as military assets. And so as slaves escape to Union lines, it seems foolhardy to return them to their enslavers, even though under the fugitive slave law, federal officers and state officers, for that matter, are required to assist in the recapture of escaped slaves. So the Lincoln administration is basically prosecuting a war to ensure compliance with federal law, but complying with federal law is a very serious attack on winning the war. And so what is the Lincoln administration supposed to do? And the answer is it doesn't make a decision. It basically just keeps wishing that this problem is going to go away, that the war will be over, and the Lincoln administration will never have to answer this question. And ultimately, as we know, the war doesn't end in 6 months or a year. And as federal armies move south, this becomes an even bigger problem. In addition, both escaped slaves and free blacks in the North are saying, hey, we want to participate. We want to help. We want to be involved. We want to fight for our freedom, because they recognized, I think before most American whites did, that the South was going to be forced to abandon slavery, that the war was going, that the slavery was going to be a casualty of the war. And so they saw participation in the war effort as fighting for the end of slavery. And that was certainly something the Lincoln administration, or Lincoln himself, didn't want to do, because there is nothing more frightening to racist whites than armed African Americans, and certainly nothing that's going to antagonize the border states like black soldiers in federal uniforms. But as the Secretary of War, Cameron, of course, is saying, hey, I need men, I need weapons. Let's train African Americans. They want to join the war effort. Let's train them. And it's an outgrowth of Cameron's shockingly progressive views on race for his era. Cameron has a black servant that he recognizes is incredibly intelligent, and ends up educating the man, who goes on to be the Liberian minister to the United States. When Cameron leaves the State Department, he writes very movingly about Frank Dasher, who is a black clerk in the State Department. He basically says that he had known this man for decades and couldn't have succeeded as Secretary of War without his help. Cameron does not appear to have held the same racist views that many American whites did during this period. And so part of his advocacy for arming African Americans is, I think, an effort to make a social statement. Cameron gets nowhere arguing with his with his cabinet colleagues. This is not something they want to hear. They ultimately don't really want to do this, and so he gets shouted down. And so beginning in the fall of 1861, he tries a new tactic. He begins showing up at abolitionist meetings. He doesn't say anything, but the Secretary of War, standing next to the stage where an abolitionist is giving an incredibly fiery speech demanding the enlistment of African Americans, sends a message. Cameron doesn't have to talk. His very presence is an implicit endorsement. But again, this proves to be too subtle. The Lincoln is not going to be moved by this. And so in December of 1861, Cameron takes a fateful step. In the War Department report to the president, from which the president is expected to draft his annual message to Congress, Cameron argues that the administration should adopt a policy of enlisting African Americans. And to be sure that the point doesn't get buried in a government report, he sends it out to a variety of different newspapers before giving it to Lincoln. You can imagine once Lincoln finds this out, he blows his stovepipe hat. He orders the Postmaster General Montgomery Blair to get copies of the report back. Of course, Blair can only get some of them back. And then, Lincoln's got an even bigger scandal in his hands. Not only is the Secretary of War saying we should arm African Americans, but Lincoln is trying to bury that fact and prevent it from being disseminated. And from that moment, Cameron is largely sidelined in the Lincoln administration. And within a month, Lincoln accepts his letter of resignation, which, curiously enough, Cameron didn't actually write. But Cameron is an incredibly important political figure from an incredibly important state politically. You can't just fire this man. You need to let him down gently. And so Lincoln sends him to be U.S. minister to Russia. And Russia is really kind of the dumping ground for inconvenient Pennsylvania politicians. James Buchanan had been minister to Russia in the 1830s. After Cameron comes back and really solidifies his control over Pennsylvania, the former governor of Pennsylvania, who's a rival of Cameron's in the Republican Party, ends up getting sent to Russia. It's really the place where you park inconvenient Pennsylvania politicians. But as we gear up for Lincoln's reelection fight in 1864, he needs Pennsylvania. And he's facing a really unique challenge in that McClellan is a Pennsylvania native. He's a favorite son. And so everyone, if you're betting, is going to bet that McClellan is going to take Pennsylvania, and with it the election, and then the war is over, because McClellan's a peace Democrat. And so as a result, Lincoln turns to the one man he knows can deliver Pennsylvania, and that's Simon Cameron. And Cameron does. Pennsylvania goes for Lincoln. Lincoln wins the election, and he knows he owes Cameron his reelection. Now, you might ask yourself, why would Cameron get Lincoln reelected? Well, there are two reasons. One is Cameron believes in the war effort. As Secretary of War, he advocates the most vigorous fight against the Confederacy imaginable. He argues at every instance for taking the strongest possible measures to ensure victory in the war. In addition, and there's a more selfish reason, Lincoln's reelection, if owed to Simon Cameron, will rehabilitate Cameron and will allow him to stake a claim to being the Republican leader of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If he can get Lincoln reelected during the middle of an unpopular war against a favorite son in a key state, there's really no one in the Republican Party who can displace Simon Cameron in Pennsylvania. And this ultimately is the trajectory of Cameron's career. He gets Lincoln reelected in 1864. He returns to the Senate in 1867, beginning a 10-year stint, during which he's in the Senate for almost the entirety of Reconstruction. When Ulysses S. Grant is elected in 1868, Grant takes an immediate dislike to the senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, and ultimately engineers Sumner being thrown out of the chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, then as now the most prestigious Senate committee. And incidentally, something I talk a lot about in my book on the Grant presidency. So if you're looking to buy two books, think about them in dialogue with one another. And ultimately turns to a man he can trust, and that man is Simon Cameron. And from 1871 until Grant leaves in 1877, Cameron plays a really key part in pushing forward the Grant administration's foreign policy, to the point where Secretary of State Hamilton Fish writes Cameron this incredibly enthusiastic letter and talks about how great a friend of the administration Cameron is, and how the administration's great achievements are mostly foreign policy achievements, and how the administration really owes that to Cameron. I mean, he is a key political figure nationwide, to the point where he engineers his son, Donald, also a Union League member, becoming Grant's last Secretary of War. And then when Cameron retires from the Senate in 1877, Donald takes over the family business, as it were, is elected to the Senate, and takes over as head of Cameron's political machine. Cameron spends the next 12 years of his life as sort of the sage of Pennsylvania, dispensing political wisdom as what we would call sort of an elder statesman. And shockingly, for a man in his mid-80s, gets himself entangled in a sex scandal that is, in many ways, the trial of the 19th century. And I certainly hope someone will ask me about that during the question and answer period. I noticed that we have been going for about half an hour. And so I'd like to open it up to the question and answer period right now. And I'm going to see who we have. So Robert Cavalier asks, what was the motivation to portray Cameron as corrupt? That is a fantastic question, Robert. Part of it was partisan politics. I mean, the 19th century is an incredibly partisan era. I think for people that may have come of age in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of this century, it's hard to imagine just how partisan and violent the 19th century was. I mean, even now, even as we're living through a period of incredible partisanship that is distressing and upsetting, senators are not dueling on the Senate floor. There's a great story when Cameron was first in the Senate in the 1840s. He lost his bid for re-election in 1848, and Bruce, you're my kind of dirtbag. I love it. We'll get there. And Cameron actually, when he was leaving the Senate, his Senate seat in March of 1849, was giving a speech. And this senator, Henry S. Foote, who was just kind of a dirtbag all around, was drunk most of the time, came up to Cameron, and the Congressional Globe described him as, with arms akimbo and an outrageous attitude, by which they meant drunk, and started yelling at Cameron to shut up because he wasn't a senator anymore. And Cameron doesn't even stop speaking. He just punches Foote in the face. Foote drops, and Foote's friends have to drag him off the Senate floor. There's a fantastic book about political violence in the 19th century. And after you've read my book, Amiable, Scoundrel, and my book, The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, you should pick it up. It's by Joanne S. Freeman, who is an incredible historian from Yale, and it's called Field of Blood. And it'll give you a really great feel for the ways in which political partisanship operated in this period. And I investigated these charges of corruption, and I unpacked them in the book. They're fairly complicated to get into in this forum. But again, it's a lot of smoke and not a lot of flame. And it has a lot to do with partisan politics and about Whigs versus Democrats, and almost nothing to do with, was he actually corrupt? Amanda Rockwood, how did Cameron lose control of the state machine to Matthew Quay? Cameron doesn't lose control of the state machine. It sort of migrates to Quay. Jay Donald, who is Cameron's son, is nowhere near the politician or the political organizer that Cameron, his father, was. And Quay was, quite frankly, just better and came up through the machine, and in many ways was sort of the logical person to take over as a result. Even in the 1930s, they're still calling this the Cameron machine, even though after the 1880s, the Cameron family is gone, has nothing to do with it, which is a testament, I think, to Cameron's machine building skills, that it became self-perpetuating. It wasn't just built around the Cameron family. It was a tangible being that had an existence all of its own and brought lieutenants up who then move into the leadership. I hope that answers your question. Amanda Rockwood, again, did Cameron have a political ideology? That's a really good question. And I will say that previous historians have argued that Cameron was nothing but an opportunist. That Cameron did whatever was popular and was always looking at the odds. In Amiable, Scoundrel, I argue that that's untrue. I argue that to the degree that Cameron has an ideology, it's doing what he considers to be best for Pennsylvania's interests. And so in the 1820s and 1830s and early 1840s, he can do that by being a Democrat, because the Democratic Party is relatively big tent. Pennsylvania Democrats always had a reputation for being kind of weird in the party. I mean, Martin Van Buren, I don't know if he uses the word weird, but that's basically what he says about them. They tended to be high tariff when the party was low tariff generally. They tended to be pro-industrial development when the party tended to be more agrarian. But it was a big enough, and they tended to be pro-banking, even though the Democratic Party was largely anti-banking. And if you're looking for a great book on that, you can check out Paul Kahan, The Bank War, Andrew Jackson, Nicholas Biddle, and the Fight for American Finance. By the 1840s, the Democratic Party isn't taking on an increasingly Southern tilt. It's becoming more dogmatic, particularly after the Mexican-American War. You get this massive influx of territory, and then the debates become about how do we, what mechanisms do we do to incorporate this territory and basically make it slave states? And increasingly, the Democratic Party is beholden to Southern slave interests. And it's about that time that Cameron recognizes that the Democratic Party isn't doing anything for Pennsylvania. And that's when he jumps ship, first to the Know Nothing Party and then to the Republican Party. And again, the Republican Party in 1860 doesn't necessarily have a well thought out and comprehensive political platform. I mean, it's an amalgamation of people who are more or less opposed to slavery, but on a very wide spectrum. They don't really have an economic policy. They don't really have any sort of comprehensive stuff on anything other than slavery. And it's interesting because Lincoln actually sends, during the 1860 campaign, when Cameron is stumping for Lincoln, Lincoln sends Cameron a bunch of speeches that he had given in the 1840s about the tariff. And he says, here, give these to your people who are asking about the tariff, but don't let it get out anywhere else because we're running as low tariff people in other places. So you get a sense, again, of how fluid these kinds of things are. I think ideology is not the right word. I don't think Cameron is ideological in that sense, but I do think that throughout his career, the one common thread that you can see is commitment to Pennsylvania's state interests as he understood them. Joe asks, was Cameron an asset to Pennsylvania? I guess that depends. I mean, it depends on ultimately what you mean by asset. Cameron and his political machine give Pennsylvania a seat at the table. Pennsylvania Philadelphia hosts the 1876 Centennial Exhibition. That owes a great deal to Cameron and his political strength. Pennsylvanians sit in cabinets. That owes a lot to the strength of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, which owes a lot to Cameron's political machine. As I'm writing now a history of Philadelphia, right now I'm talking about the late 19th century, and what you see is a lot of corruption, and Philadelphia in particular is a one-party town, and there are all kinds of these political shenanigans that are used to enrich the Republican Party at the expense of the public good and at the expense of democracy. And so in that regard, Cameron and these machine politicians were not a good part or good for Pennsylvania. I think ultimately it's a mixed bag, and it depends on what you mean. I think there are a lot of positive things that Cameron is able to deliver. I also think there are a lot of negative things that come from not just Cameron, but also about machine politics. Robert Cavalier, did Cameron utilize the Union League to advance his goals? If yes, how so? Yes. Cameron is in Russia when the Union League is formed, or he's just back from Russia when the Union League is formed. And ultimately, the Union League plays an incredibly role in ginning up support for the war here in Philadelphia, mobilizing people to do things like volunteer, raise funds at things like the Sanitary Commission, and ultimately advocate for the re-election of President Lincoln. And in that regard, Cameron does does use the infrastructure that's there. To the degree that he uses the Union League, that I don't know, but he certainly works with the Union League. And Cameron is a member of the Union League until 1876, when his membership is suspended for reasons that are not entirely clear. I was talking with Jim Mundy and John Miko earlier, and my guess would be that has to do with some political infighting that's going on in the Republican Party. Because remember, Philadelphia is a one-party town, but there are factions of the Republican Party. There's the sort of good government Republicans and the sort of machine politics Republicans who were kind of at loggerheads. And it's not that different from the politics of Philadelphia today, where you have, a Democratic Party that's incredibly diverse, that has sort of a progressive wing in the Philadelphia area, and then elements of the old ward healers, and they're the people who get people to show up at the polls. So in that sense, I think it's very similar. And I hope that answered the question. Bruce, tell me about the sex scandal. Okay, because you asked. Um, so Cameron and his wife have a very, what I interpret to be a very beautiful marriage. Like they seem to genuinely have loved one another. She's with him nearly all the time. So there are actually relatively few letters between the two of them. There's one that I found from the 1820s when he's working in New Orleans on a canal building project. But basically, she was with him most of the time when he was in Washington, in part because they had a mentally handicapped son who for most of his life lived with them. He spends a brief amount of time at the Pennsylvania School for what was called then the feeble-minded. That's a 19th century term. That's not my term. And then ultimately they bring him home. And he lives with Cameron for the rest of Cameron's life. So when his wife dies in the early 1870s, and allegedly, Cameron is visited by this woman who is a widow. She's looking for a federal job, and he promises to help her with the implication that she's going to trade sexual favors. He allegedly promises to marry her. That's why she sleeps with him. It's a very unusual story. And basically what happens is she keeps sending these letters like, you better marry me or else I'm going to go public with this. And then it gets even weirder. It's like, well, if you're not going to marry me, at least send me this mentally handicapped son so I can have a piece of you. The son's name is Simon Cameron Jr. It gets really, really weird. And ultimately Cameron is blowing this woman off. So she decides to go public and sues him in court for breach of contract, essentially. And the newspapers have a field day with this because it's got everything you can possibly imagine. It's got corruption, it's got sex, it's got, an allegedly corrupt politician. There's a huge age gap between Cameron and this woman. And so for about a year and a half leading up to this, as it's sort of working its way toward trial, Cameron is absolutely getting pilloried in the press. They're talking about Sliming Cameron. They're talking about him being a sex fiend. There are all these lurid stories. She, of course, is, releasing these letters that, she wrote to him. Interestingly enough, she can never release any letters that he wrote to her because allegedly he would insist on that she burn his letters. So she could never really show any letters that he had done. So they get to trial. And of course, the newspaper men are just waiting with bated breath. Oh my God, this is going to be great. She rolls in and the trial is just a zoo. She gets up on the stand and she's spinning all these lurid tales. And Cameron's counsel is former Union General Benjamin F. Butler, who is an incredibly skilled lawyer, incredibly politically connected, knows just how to skewer this woman and basically lets her talk her. The newspaper people realize pretty quickly that she's insane. And then her roommate rolls in, and the roommate is wearing a veil. She won't reveal her identity. So they refer to her as the veiled lady. And she talks about how when she was living with this woman that, she was hatching this scam. She was going to entrap some significant political figure in a sex scandal, maybe get pregnant. And basically the veiled woman is like, yeah, she did this to Simon Cameron. And so not surprisingly, the trial just ends immediately and Cameron's totally vindicated. And as a result, he is vindicated. She dies, and I want to say the 1890s, and she's running a grift in like Colorado where she's pretending to be a nun and raising money for an orphanage in a country that doesn't exist. So it's really kind of shocking. I'm going to answer one more question, and then we are going to have to end for the evening. Bruce asks, where did he get his money? That's an excellent question. So initially, the bulk of Cameron's wealth comes from printing. A lot of it through government contracts. He ends up publishing the laws of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and then later the federal contracts. And then he gets into banking, and that's really where he makes a lot of money. He opens a bank called the Bank of Middletown in in Middletown. And actually, if you will permit me, you can actually see I have some of his currency right there. Those are actually $5 and $10 bills that were printed by the Bank of Middletown and signed by Simon Cameron. And then he diversifies. He invests in railroads. He invests in an iron foundry, a variety of different other things. Cameron said, you know, whenever he would talk about these allegations that he was corrupt, he would say something like, "Why do I need to steal money? I can go out in the street and make all the money I want. I think my career demonstrates it." And to a certain extent, that was absolutely true. I mean, this man had the Midas touch. For a man that grew up with nothing, as an, you know, more or less an orphan, he really manages to do financially quite well. I don't know if he's the wealthiest member of Lincoln's cabinet, but he's certainly among the wealthiest members of Lincoln's cabinet. John Lozier says, "Thank you very much for sharing a very interesting topic. Thank you for being a great audience." And without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Jim Mundy.
Paul, thank you very, very much. That was a fascinating program. I just enjoy listening to you talk all the time. And so thank you for joining us this evening. It was a great presentation. So Cameron wasn't a bad guy after all, which is really kind of nice to know. So our next presentation in general will be our next Monday with Monday. That's me. And I'll give you a hint. It's going to be on the Titanic, because there's a wonderful connection between the Titanic, Philadelphia, and the League. And the Titanic sank on April the 15th of 1912. So we're back to that April being a month of tragedy in a lot of ways. So that's that one. And then the next cultural presentation is going to be our next virtual program, a library hour, on May the 12th. And we'll feature Dr. Lloyd Bennett, the Chief Curator and Curator of European Art at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. And he will talk about his new book, Thomas Jefferson Architect, Palladian Models, Democratic Principles, and the Conflict of Ideals. And conflict is a good way to describe Jefferson. He was a man of many conflicts himself. And DeWitt will talk about the conflict between Jefferson's political ideals and philosophies and how it affected his architecture, especially at Monticello. So that will be a fascinating program. And to make sure that you stay on top of all of our programs and make sure you're on our email list, so please email us at legacyfoundation, one word, at unionleague.org. Okay, so folks, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed it. I know I've got a lot more things to think about in Simon Cameron. So with that, we wish you a pleasant evening and stay safe and take care out there, folks. Okay, good night now.
Are we back?
All right, can we drop off?
Well, first of all, well,
We done?
Paul, are you there?
Hold on.
Yep, Paul's still there.
I am still here. I was muted.
Hold on for a second, guys.
Yep.
Sure.
Paul, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am.
Oh, there you go. That was excellent.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Oh, it was
really.
wonderful.
I mean, it's not easy to keep people's attention virtually.